Most real estate investors are one mistake away from getting sued. So today we're going to talk about the legal mistakes that investors make before they even get sued and how to structure your business the right way from day one. And today I'm here with my friend Kayla Shively. She is the founding attorney over at Churchill Shively PLC. She does all things commercial real estate law and business law. And we are so excited for her to be here today. Thank you.
I'm excited to be here too. Yes. Thank you for having me.
And we dressed as twins.
We did. It was planned.
For sure. For those of you not watching, we are dressed as twins today. So I love that. You work with all kinds of businesses and investors. You see what goes wrong behind the scenes. You are in it every day. And you see what happens when investors wing it, which I think is what a lot of investors do when they start. They just, you stumble upon your first property, you're excited to get into it, and you just start doing it. And then you never really take the time to talk to an attorney and create your structure correctly. So this is why you're here today, to talk about all of those things that you shouldn't do.
Yes, all those fun stories.
It's great. It's great. All right. So off the bat, what is the biggest legal mistake that you are seeing investors make right now? Or that you've always seen them make?
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of mistakes, but we're humans. Everybody makes mistakes. That's okay. A lot of them are nothing we can't fix. But one that I see, right. Yes, it can be fixed for a price. One that I'm seeing relatively frequently, especially for newer investors, is the failure to put their entities or their assets into a legal entity. So without that, you are really exposing your investment, your asset to personal liability. Anything that you own personally, vehicles, stocks and bonds, your personal home, other businesses could be exposed. Buying a piece of commercial real estate, an investment, even a residential piece of commercial real estate that is going to be an investment that's going to have third parties on it, is exposing you and your personal assets to liability. So I would always advise to have your items, your assets inside the four corners of a legal entity.
Yeah, and that is actually something that investors ask me all the time. And I'm going to get into this later, but it's like, oh, should I put my property in an LLC? And it's my response is always, I am not an attorney. This is what I have heard from attorneys, but you need to go seek your own legal advice. So we will get into that. But before we do, let's talk about you. How did you get into commercial law, commercial real estate law, business law? What's your story?
Yeah. So thank you for asking. I started out always being interested in law, even as I grew up. I was 5, and I actually got into an accident where I severely injured my hand. And it became kind of like a personal injury dynamic. So I grew up thinking that I really wanted to be a personal injury attorney because that attorney was just so influential and helpful for our family during a really difficult time. But then I did my first internship at law school at a personal injury firm. And I just was like, this is not it. This is not it for me. And so, I kind of focused on the books. And then I continued applying to internships. Then I interned for Fox News up in New York. And then I subsequently interned for the Charlotte Hornets here in Charlotte, the NBA team. And so those two experiences made me think, man, I really love like the hustle and bustle of sports and entertainment law. And so that was kind of what I was wanting to do. And turns out in Charlotte, unless you're working for the Hornets, the Panthers, or maybe the Charlotte Knights, the opportunities are just, next to none. So I, again, kind of like hit LinkedIn and Indeed and, what can I do? And the first opportunity that I found that I was interested in was a compliance role at Wells Fargo. Candidly, didn't really like it there. Felt very pigeonholed, not really flexing my legal muscles as much. And it was funny at that point, I was kind of looking outside of Wells and, where did I want to go? And I was like, I think I want to go work at a small firm. And it was so funny because I always said, I never want to work in one of those small law firms in a little house. Like I wanted to be at the big company, like the big corporation. That's just where I saw myself. And that was where I got an opportunity, like a small boutique commercial real estate law firm. And I just fell in love with commercial real estate there. I love driving through Charlotte and, seeing a development or a project that I worked on. And I love that like interpersonal relationship with local business owners in the city and then just like the greater North Carolina area. So I just really leaned into that. I was at the boutique firm for several years. Then, I wanted a little more opportunity. I wanted a little more upward mobility, growth opportunities. So then I went to a mid-sized firm. They had offices all over the state of North Carolina, and then mid-sized firm got acquired by an AmLaw firm to also, categorize as big law. So I was at like one of the top 200 firms in the country, working on the most sophisticated deals of my life. But again, very much like a grunt worker, not really incentivized to develop my own relationships, which I realized at that point how important my relationships were and how I wanted to, continue to grow them. And at Big Law, you're just, as an associate, it's not really, what you're paid to do. It's kind of butt in the seat, bill the hours. Mm-hmm. And so I was back after my maternity leave at Big Law. I'd been out for 4 months and I went back and I was just like, this isn't it anymore. Like I need to branch out, no pun intended, branch off partners.
Thanks for the plug.
Yes. And so I told my husband, we had a 5-month-old at the time. I was like, I think I want to start my own law firm. And he was like, what? Like, are you crazy? And I think at the time, maybe I was a little crazy. But, he supported me and, I haven't looked back ever since. I really wanted to found a firm that was based on, biblical principles, because I feel like the bigger the company you get to, not always, there's exceptions to the rule, but oftentimes the larger the company, the less mission, like the less of a foundation that they have. It becomes more about dollars than people. And so I wanted to start that. And so even on my business card, you'll see like Philippians 1:6, which is he who began a good work in me will see it through to the day of Christ Jesus. And so I never set out to own my own law firm. It just kind of, I think God like told me to do it. And so I lean on that a lot when I think, something crazy comes up or a situation, a difficult challenge in the firm. And I'm like, no, like I'm here for a reason. And my faith has really helped me persevere through that. But that's a lot of how we look to serve our clients too. So
I love that. We're very similar in our businesses being faith-based, which again, we'll talk about later. But okay, so what is it about the type of law that you do? Do you like the law itself, or is it the people that you work with that are involved in these type of deals or situations? Like, what is it about it that you like?
It's a little bit of both. So I think if I did anything, it would always be about the people because I love people. I'm definitely like a people person, but as it pertains to commercial real estate and what I do, I can work with a startup company that has been saving money forever, and this is like their first brick and mortar location. And something like that is so exciting for me, especially being a small business owner, because you know exactly what goes into that. And it's just exciting. Or it could be like a franchisee who really believes in this franchise and they're opening their first space or maybe their fourth space. Just helping people, multiply and prosper, whatever it is they're passionate about. That is, the component of it that I really like. And I always tell people, because people will think I litigate, and I don't litigate at all. I'm very much a transactional attorney. But I always tell people, like, I like to keep the deals on the tracks. Like, I like to get your deals done. And so, like, getting to that finish line, too, is always very rewarding. Sometimes, there's compromises that have to be made, but ultimately, getting the deal finished is very satisfying to me as an attorney.
For sure. Did you have a defining moment where you realized that investors and business owners just really needed that legal advice that you wanted to give them? Was there like a time where you're like, you know what, like this, I want to be able to help people do this better?
That's a tough one. I think I've had a lot of those moments where I'm like, I want to help people do this better. But I mean, even boiling it down to like attorney availability, I think is a big issue in the legal world. I cannot tell you how many people call me. I've called several other firms and I can't get an attorney on the phone. And, you know, then they want to do a consult and they have to pay for a consult. And, you know, we're not at that point. But I mean, I think attorney availability is extremely important. And there are a lot of clients or potential clients who call my firm like, hey, you know, can I speak to an attorney? What do you think about this? And I'll talk to them generally about whatever their situation is. And maybe I'm not the right fit or they're not ready to engage, what have you. But just that availability I have found to be so valuable, because even if the person is not ready to commit or their deal is not something that I'm going to work on for them, it always comes back around. Like, you know, they connected me to someone who does have something I can work on, or, you know, it just always comes full circle. So I'd say availability is something that's important. I don't think that really definitively answers your question, but I think it's a struggle that a lot of people have when they're looking at to put a deal together, or they just need like a quick, you know, answer to a question. And a lot of times that can kind of bottleneck things without having an attorney who's accessible.
You know, and I feel you on that, because I'm a real estate agent. It's part of what I do. And sometimes I'm like, people will thank me, like, thank you for answering the phone, or thank you for answering my question. And it's like, wait, like, is it really that easy? Like, I just have to be available and communicate and pick up my phone, and it sounds like it's the same thing in the attorney world. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as long as, you know, you're actually genuinely wanting to help people, you will always have business.
Yes.
Because people will know that if you're genuine.
And I'd say too, like, you know, what type of service do I provide? And like, you know, how do I feel like people could have benefited from that in starting a firm? You know, so many people have told me too, like, I didn't even talk to the attorney until I got to the closing table. I didn't know them at all. Like, you know, it was just correspondence with paralegal or what have you. And I really try to like create a relationship with my clients. Like, I want to know about what's your business, what's your passion, you know, why are you doing this, and how can I help you? And so I think there's a lot of missed opportunity in that realm as well.
What do you think that like most investors misunderstand about attorneys?
I think a lot of investors and just people in general, I think that they think when you're an attorney, you do everything.
You know all the laws.
You know all the laws, and I'd love to say that I do, but I absolutely do not. You know, people have their specialties, and I would also caution anyone who's looking for an attorney to be weary of firms, and maybe not firms, but especially individual attorneys who have 15 practice areas, because it's like, if you are a jack of all trades, you're a master of none. And so, you know, practice areas, niches are there for a reason. But, you know, also an attorney should be able to tell you, I don't know. Like, I don't know the answer, or this is not within my wheelhouse. So I think, we don't do it all. If they do, I would be running the other direction.
Just like a doctor, right? Like
right.
I would rather go to a specialist who is a cardiologist who, if I have a heart issue, than someone who's a generalist. No offense to the doctors, but I'd rather have someone who practices that specific thing every single day. So I totally get that. For sure. So let's kind of get into entities. We talked about LLCs early on. And as I said, that is the question I get all the time. So should I, like, I'm buying my first properties, should I put it into an LLC? Should it stay in my personal name? And again, the answer I give people is I am not an attorney. This is what attorneys have told me, but you should definitely go talk to an attorney and get legal advice. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about one LLC versus multiple LLCs. What do you see? What do you typically recommend? How's that look?
So first and foremost, I would say 100% always have your asset in some type of legal entity, whether that's a corporation, whether that's an LLC, have it in something. Because the cost of maintaining those legal entities is next to none compared to like your exposure and liability. So 100% always have something.
Cost. So cost of maintaining them, is that like the annual reports that you file?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it would be the cost of annual reports, you know, the initial setup, you know, you're going to have to pay something. A lot of people will pull, you know, entity documentation off of websites, which I also would not recommend, but you can do it. If you want to do it really cheap, you can. I would almost always recommend enlisting an attorney to set up your entity. But yeah, so you have the initial startup fees, filing with the Secretary of State, filing your articles, getting an operating agreement if you're doing an LLC, or bylaws if you're doing a corporation. And then that annual report every year, just making sure you file it. But I mean, all in, depending on, attorney that you use and entity formation costs, I mean, you're looking at initially maybe $1,000, and on an annual basis, maybe $100 to keep everything in good standing.
Yeah, for sure. So you're on the team where if you have one property, you're putting that property in an LLC.
Mm-hmm,
Like
absolutely.
That is what
100%. And the annual report too, it's very, seasonal, but April 15th is when they're due. And if you don't file that, you are literally at risk of losing your legal entity status. So like if you fall out of compliance with the Secretary of State because you haven't filed something as simple as your annual report, then even if your LLC or your property is held in an LLC, you're still subjected to personal liability. And it's just a simple filing on the Secretary of State. And just another plug, there are so many scams out there for those filings as well. So just always make sure you're doing that filing on the Secretary of State.gov website, because so many companies will try to get you to pay $300 to file a report. That's nothing.
It's super easy. I actually did mine and my dad's last week, and it brings you through. You just find it on the Secretary of State, you search your business, it goes through, it says file your annual report, you go through the prompts, you pay your $203 or however much it is, and you're good to go. So, okay, so how about, are you on the team where if you have multiple houses, do you need different entities for every house? Or like, would you tell people if you have a bunch of single family and a bunch of commercial and a bunch of multifamily, would those each go in separate entities? What are you the team of? Because I've heard it all from attorneys.
Yeah, I think either one works. If you have a bunch of different properties, ideally, I think you'd want to see those in separate entities, probably under like an umbrella entity or like a holding company, for the simple fact that, if property A, there's a slip and fall, and there's a lawsuit, if you have all of your assets in one bucket or one entity, that lawsuit can attach to any of your other assets. So ideally, you'd want to have them in separate buckets, especially if one property is more prone to issues than another. You don't want your cash cow asset probably coupled with one that's really prone to issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but I think either works. Either way works.
And then at what level for investors does that LLC entity structure, that simple structure, change? Like, is there a tipping point where you're like, okay, you're at 20 properties, now you should really be an S corp, or whatever that is?
Yeah, so that tips into like a little bit of tax advice. I will say I am an S corporation. I'm taxed as an S corporation, but I'm an LLC. And I think it gets into taxes, but from my understanding, you're paying a slightly less taxes at a certain threshold when you're taxed as an S corporation than an LLC. But I will also say an LLC, it's a lot easier. Like, there's much less maintenance because you can pull money over. It's not really an issue with the S corporation. You got to run payroll. So you have to pay yourself as an employee. So there's more like papering that has to happen. So I think an LLC is fine for the outset of most organizations. But then once you get to a certain point, then, S corporation taxes may have some benefits, but it's kind of getting into like the CPA world, but that's, my personal experience.
We actually had a tax strategist on last show.
Oh yeah.
So it'll be good to
go back to that one.
Refer back to that one and then watch this one again, and all your questions will be answered.
Yes.
So what's one of the biggest structuring mistakes that you see with investors and business owners when they're coming to you, besides not having anything at all?
I would say not having anything at all, or they have something and it's just fallen out of compliance, or you have an entity. But like I've had this happen multiple times where I have a client who comes to me, we have an LLC, we have an operating agreement, but it's not signed. So if the document is not signed by all the members, then presumably you're still subject to the North Carolina general statute. So like, make sure that the documentation that you have, that you paid for, is official and that it's working for you. that would be the next thing besides not having anything.
I
Make
mean,
sure you got your ducks in a row.
Yeah, and that actually kind of takes me to the next thing I want to talk about. And we kind of hear this too often is, you find a property, you and your best friend want to buy it together, and you're gonna wing it. You're gonna go in there, you're gonna buy it together. One of you is gonna bring capital, one of you is gonna bring the sweat equity, and you have no agreement.
Yeah.
So that's a thing. Why is that dangerous?
Oh, so many reasons. So many reasons. Number one, I would say, and I see this all the time across the board in transactions, if someone is going to verbalize something to you, they should be comfortable putting it into a contract. I see this all the time, like commercial lease negotiations, acquisitions, sales, like, so-and-so said this, but they're not willing to put it in the contract. So it's like, well, if you said it, your word should mean something. You should be comfortable putting it in the agreement. I see that happen a lot. But not having an agreement at all is very risky because it doesn't contemplate what has been put into it. Is it truly 50-50 or was it more 30-70? You stand to lose a lot more when there's nothing written down. And I would also say, to the extent, you're going to do it a partnership, don't. But if you do decide to do a partnership with your friend, a 50-50 situation, make sure that operating agreement or those bylaws has very clear dissolution language or very clear buyout provisions, because I have almost always never seen a partnership work out. And when it doesn't work out, those are the provisions that they're relying on to get out and to exit.
So you love partnerships, is what you're saying?
No partnerships. No partnerships.
All right, so we've thrown out a few terms here. I just want to break down the terms for some people who don't speak the legalese. Like, you do this. I'm not an attorney, but I'm in it. So all right, we talked about the annual reports, so people should know what that means. We talked about the LLC. So you mentioned the articles of incorporation. So let's talk about what that is, and then let's talk about an operating agreement. So what are the articles of incorporation?
So depending on what legal entity you're going to form, so corporation or an LLC, that depends on what you're going to submit to the Secretary of State to formalize the entity. So for an LLC, you're going to have articles of organization, and that's just, who is the member, what is the registered agent address, sign, file, and it establishes the entity with the state. Articles of incorporation are for corporations. So it's the same thing. It's just a document that formalizes to the Secretary of State that you're setting up an entity, and kind of who to contact to the extent that business needs to be communicated with.
And then so operating agreement. What is an operating agreement? What is the importance of an operating agreement? What should be in there?
So operating agreement for LLCs, and then the synonymous term for corporations is bylaws. So those documents are like the governing document of the legal entity. That's going to go over like, what are the percentage interests? Is there a buyout provision? What do we do if we want to dissolve? And ultimately what those documents do and why they're important is, in the absence of having them, you are subject to the North Carolina General Statute. And the North Carolina General Statute is extremely long, very cumbersome, and honestly, some operating agreements and bylaws are that as well. But those documents can be tailored specifically to what you want your entity to do and how you want it to function.
So when you say the general statute, what exactly does that mean?
So North Carolina, has a slew of general statutes. So there's the North Carolina Limited Liability Company Act, and then there's North Carolina Corporation Act. So absent a, fully executed, signed operating agreement or bylaws, your company is subject to those provisions that are, governed by the state.
Got it.
As to your organization.
Okay. All right. Makes sense. And then you mentioned the buy, sell clauses. So let's talk about that for a little bit. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so that it essentially gives the initial members the ability to exit for a price, or the ability for another member in the company, to buy them out to the extent they wanted to. So, it creates a situation that's a little more seamless. If there is a problem, you have a member who has a capital issue at some point, they no longer want to participate in the business. It allows the business to go on in their absence, and it has very clear provisions as to how to get them out or, how to bring somebody in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if someone wanted that, then you would just draft that for them.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something that you would have a template where you're like, these are the common things that are in a buy-sell agreement, or these are the common things that are in an operating agreement, and then
Mm-hmm.
you talk through it with your client and they pick what they want in there. Is that typically how it works?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So what are some ways, I know you love partnerships. What are some ways to protect yourself from a bad partner?
I would say I would never do 50-50. I think that's just a setup for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be a majority interest holder and a minority interest holder. All could have voting rights, but you need some ability to tip the scales.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that first and foremost. Again, like clear dissolution, like if you are going to dissolve, what are the ramifications for that? Buy-sell opportunities to the extent someone needs to get out. Because a lot of times, if you don't have a buy-sell provision in a governing document, the only option is to dissolve.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, when I've seen these partnerships or businesses fall apart, there's usually one person who wants to keep everything going. But many documents don't contemplate that. They're just like, well, if the two people no longer want to operate, then we're going to dissolve. So it gives them a parachute,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you see this, I bet, because you talked about how you do consultations. So like someone calls you, they're a partnership, and they're like, all right, they ask you all the questions, you consult them, you tell them everything that they need. And they're like, you know what? I'm going to hold off on that.
Mm-hmm.
What usually happens in those instances? Do they call you back 6 months later and they're like, I had a really bad breakup with my partner. Like, what do you typically see? Does that happen?
Yeah, that definitely does happen. Yeah, it definitely does. I've even drafted things for people. I'm like, make sure you get this signed. Like, make sure everybody signs it. And then again, like, 6 months later, oh, the business is falling apart. My business partner did X, Y, Z. And it's like, okay, well, let's reference your operating agreement. And they didn't sign it. So it's like, okay, now you're referring back to the North Carolina General Statute. You got this operating agreement drafted. You paid money to do it. Your hard-earned money. You spent time going through it, and it's really of no value to you if it's not signed. You can't enforce it against someone who didn't sign it. So
you do commercial real estate, so I'm sure you deal with leases. So
yes.
Let's get into that a little bit.
Okay.
So commercial leases, and then do you do any residential leases, or are you mainly on the commercial lease side?
Mainly commercial.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see in commercial leases that you review and you're like, oh, what is this?
Yeah. I feel like most of the pitfalls are on the tenant side normally because typically landlords, they have their form, they know what works, it's tried and true. But for tenants, there are a lot of issues because, a lot of times it's their first commercial space. So some of the pitfalls I see often are there's no memorandum of lease provision in the lease. So in North Carolina, a memorandum of lease applies if your tenancy is for a duration of 3 years or longer, and that does encompass optional renewal terms. If you don't have one and you're a tenant and the landlord decides to sell the property during the time that you're leasing it, it essentially allows a subsequent purchaser or landlord of the center to not recognize your tenancy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I always advise tenants, especially those who are putting a lot of dollars into their upfit, to make sure that we negotiate a memorandum of lease provision, because otherwise a new landlord can come in and just oust them. Like, oh no, actually we don't want a real estate law firm in our center. We want to use that space for our admin office. So it protects your interests as a tenant. Other things I see is like, especially in shopping centers, that the tenant is just blanket responsible for any possible HVAC issue. Mm-hmm. HVAC can be very expensive, and a lot of times the replacement of a unit can fall on a tenant, and that can be really costly, particularly if you haven't done an inspection of that HVAC unit before you take the space. I mean, that HVAC unit could be on its last leg. And if you go in and you're responsible for all the maintenance and repairs and replacements, that's a big expenditure for a tenant.
Do you find that landlords will negotiate that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Most of them will. What I like to do is like a HVAC cap. If they're like, no, tenant's got to be responsible for some of the repairs. Maintenance is normally going to be a tenant responsibility. Like you have to maintain the unit, you got to do quarterly maintenance or what have you. But the replacements and the major repairs is where it really gets dicey. If a landlord is like, no, absolutely not, like tenant has to have some maintenance repair obligations, we'll negotiate like a cap, like what the landlord what the tenant can expect to pay annually for repairs, and then, what contribution they could be expected to pay for a replacement.
And that's in a standard commercial lease, because I think we manage some commercial properties, and that is in there. And then we typically put that cap, whether it's $5,000 or whatever, however big the property is.
Yeah.
And the memorandum of lease is also interesting. I don't know if if that is automatically in the standard North Carolina lease, commercial lease. I don't think that it is.
I don't think so either.
Yeah.
So that's a big one.
We have had a tenant send one. Their attorney sent one to us.
Yeah.
So if it is sent to you from an attorney and you're like managing the property, do you have to sign that or?
No. I mean, if it's set out in your lease agreement, like what I do when I represent tenants is I say, like, I have a memorandum of lease section, and it says contemporaneously with the execution of this lease, landlord and tenant will execute memorandum of lease and Exhibit C. And then it needs to be mailed to my office so I can record it within 3 days of lease execution.
Okay.
So without that contractual obligation, no, a landlord does not have to play ball or sign that.
Okay.
And other things I would say too that are major pitfalls for tenants, particularly, is audit rights for landlord's books. So a lot of times, tenants are paying TICAM, so like taxes, insurance, common area maintenance, and particularly on common area maintenance is where you want to see the landlord's books. If you're getting overcharged or undercharged, you want to have, and you have some presumption that maybe that's the case. Maybe your CAM went up 25% in a year. You may want to ask to inspect the landlord's books.
What's CAM? Explain that, break that down.
Yeah, so common area maintenance.
Okay, got it.
If you're in like a center, there's a parking lot, there's land that has to be maintained, there's landscaping, a lot of the exterior for like a shopping center will fall into common area maintenance. If there's security, sometimes janitorial, that type of stuff will fall into common area maintenance. So if things shoot up, a lot of times the tenant is like, oh wow, my CAM is so much more. Why is this? And landlord will say, oh, well, this year, security costs more, or we painted the building, it costs a lot more. But a lot of times tenants want to see that itemization. And then, what I often put in my leases for tenants is that if there is an overcharge, that landlord's going to reimburse them.
Okay. Do you mainly, when you're doing commercial leases, are you mainly or is it 50-50, on the tenant side or on the landlord side?
I do both. I definitely represent more tenants. Yeah. But there are some landlords I represent too. Okay. Yeah.
What do you think what is the biggest difference between a commercial lease and a residential lease? Like, I know you talked about TICAM obviously is not in a residential lease, but besides that, and then the HVAC cap, we're paying for the HVAC. What are some other big differences between the two?
Residential leases, you are subject to a lot more, both are subject to laws, but they're generally, residential is more controlled than commercial. Residential is subject to like HUD a lot of times, and, different federal regulations, where commercial is kind of like the wild, wild west. It's like whatever you contract for the most part. Now there are some things that apply, like usury, default rates that can come into play, but generally speaking, with any commercial real estate transaction, it's presumed that the parties are sophisticated and that the parties are seeking their own counsel. So you have to be really careful in those contracts, especially because there's not really guardrails like there are with residential documents.
That definitely makes sense. And then you hear a lot about around commercial leases about personal guarantees.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that? Why is that a thing?
Mm-hmm.
Explain that.
Yeah, those are rough. But it's very, very common. I mean, I see it in almost every commercial lease that I negotiate. And essentially what a personal guarantee is to the extent the legal entity that is the tenant, so the LLC or the corporation that is serving as the tenant in the contract, if they cannot perform, they can't pay the rent, or they decide to abandon the property, or they owe funds to landlord, that landlord can't recoup from said entity, then it gives the landlord the ability to go after the individual who owns that legal entity for whatever they need in order to recoup their costs. So again, even though you have that legal entity protection, it still gives the landlord the ability to kind of backdoor that and still come after you personally.
Okay.
And you see it a lot. I mean, it's always in a commercial lease. But there are also a lot of those sentiments in franchise agreements. Just word to the wise, always, if you're entering into a franchise agreement, have an attorney look at it first, because it's very common in those as well.
Always. I mean, every time a contract is involved, outside of a residential lease, I'd say reach out to an attorney. That is just the advice that I always give.
And you can argue it too. I mean, with a personal guarantee, you can say, especially if you're a company that has established financials, like you've been in business for 15 years and you can show what your income is year over year, like really like push that to a landlord and say, no, we don't really need a personal guarantee because our business can more than cover any expense that could occur under this lease. Or if landlord won't play ball with that, then I would advise to negotiate like a sunset provision. So, okay, landlord wants a personal guarantee for the full duration of the lease. Well, after we pay on time for 3 years and no default has taken place, then let's like void off the guarantee.
Oh, okay.
So that's an option too.
Okay, interesting. All right, let's talk about some crap moments. Let's talk about the fun stuff. Let's get into the stories here. What's one of the worst situations that you've ever seen an investor or business owner come to you with?
I've had a few of those. One I would say that's relatively recent. It was a gentleman who was buying a commercial property off of a major highway here in North Carolina, and his broker and him, for whatever reason, had not engaged an attorney until really like the very last minute. So due diligence is expired, money has gone hard, closing is in like a week and a half, and like no attorney has been engaged. So I get the phone call like, hey, can you help us out? And so, I kind of looked at my schedule and what I had going on, and I was like, well, if this is going to be done on a rush basis, but I can help you guys get to the finish line. And I really pride myself on that, where, because they had contacted a few other offices who were like, no way, like you should have called us months ago. And at the time I was like, I have the time, like, let me help these guys out. So, you get involved, you start pulling back the layers. These are all North Carolina Association of Realtors forms. And that was another reason why I was like, okay, like they're pretty predictable forms. Like it can't be too crazy. But then in looking at the title, there were a lot of issues, one of which was a billboard easement, which at the time I didn't think would be a huge problem. But please be wary of billboard easements. They are very invasive. The rent on them is next to nothing. You really cannot build in any area that's going to impact the visibility of that billboard. You're responsible a lot of times for removing it if the company decides they no longer want to operate a billboard on your property. They have a lot of automatic renewal terms, so they just automatically renew for the same rent. There's no increase. It continues on into oblivion. And I have found that they've been very difficult to deal with. So my client wanted to build in a spot that was, going to impact that that billboard visibility from the highway. And so it was a lot of back and forth. But I'd say getting a title examination done early before your due diligence is huge, because you have all the leverage in the world at that point. If there's an issue, you go back to the seller and you say, hey, we're not going to close unless this is resolved. And you can still get your deposit back. You can walk. But if you blow past that due diligence period, you are really fighting an uphill battle at that point. Like, you're kind of stuck with it unless you're willing to forego that deposit.
Yeah, that is definitely important. So has there been a time where someone comes to you, they think it's just like a small thing, just have this small issue, and it end up turning into a lawsuit?
I had one that was pretty close to lawsuit. Luckily, I didn't get to that point. But another client I worked with, she was just going to do a simple loan closing. So she had purchased some rural property a couple of years prior. And she was like, oh, I'm really ready to construct. I'm going to build a wedding venue. Like, I just need you to help me close on this loan for the construction. I'm like, oh, no problem. You closed on it 2 years ago. Title will not be an issue because presumably it was searched 2 years ago when you acquired the property. I just need to come forward from that to the extent you're good with that, presuming she would be. And then we'll just get the loan closed for you. Like, should be cut and dry. And she had a title insurance owner's policy from when she acquired the property. So I took a look at that. Saw there were a couple easements on it, but nothing that really, rattled me or was a red flag. And then we get into the title examination. I'm just reviewing the chain of title, like the deeds. And there was a deed that was probably 2 owners behind her. So where party A transferred to party B, but party A in the deed retained rights to hunt on this property basically forever. So it was applicable to all successors and assigns. So I'm reviewing this chain of title. I'm like, oh, wow, that's kind of a big issue. Like, there's people that have hunting rights on this property, and you're going to be having weddings. Like, that's a problem. And this is like 60 acres, so half was going to be a wedding venue. The other half was going to be like her home, where she has small children. So I brought this up to her, and I was like, hey, like, did you know that there was this, these rights, to use your property? And she was like, no, but we have deer cams up, and we've seen guys like walking around our property with guns. And I was like, okay, well, it's probably them. So come to find out, I guess the attorney who had reviewed title at that point did not see that or know about it. And, it became a huge problem. Title insurance was like, we're not going to insure. Bank is like, we're not going to lend. Like, this has to go away. And the only way to get it to go away is to have these gentlemen who had these rights to sign their rights away. And so we had to get this other attorney involved, and I hated it for that particular attorney, but he had to go back, and all I know is a check was written and the document was signed. So it ended up working out, but it was a nightmare. I mean, the whole deal, the financing, the construction was all on the line because some people had some hunting rights on the property.
Wow, that is crazy.
It was. So title searches are really important. And I think that emphasizes the importance of, not always, it's called tacking when you started a prior policy and you go forward. Tacking is not always the best option, because when you tack, you're relying on a prior attorney's title examination and their search. And if they miss something, your title insurance is not going to cover it. So a lot of times I advise my clients, I know it's been searched previously. I don't know who did the search. Let's do a full search on this. And so I always give my clients the option, but title examination and who's doing it and what endorsements you get on your policy, all of that is extremely important.
So I'm sure we have people listening right now that are like, I probably need to clean this up.
Yeah.
I would say that the next step for you who is listening is to call an attorney. If it's not Kayla, you need to call somebody
Yes,
right
you
now.
do. Yeah, call them. Call them.
Right now. And, guys, this is what we do at Rich Wealth Partners. We are always talking about building your real estate investing business as a business. It's not a side hustle. You may think it's a side hustle. It may start that way, but you may as well get it set up correctly from the beginning. This is why you have attorneys on your team, you have your tax strategists on your team, you have your real estate agent, your property manager, you have all these people to help you with these things so you don't make these mistakes. That is truly what we want you to do. Have the proper entity structure, connect with the right people, and create a plan and be intentional. That's what we do. Kayla, I asked this question to everybody. What book are you reading right now?
So actually, Christina was kind enough to gift me a book for Christmas. And admittedly, I have not read it yet, but
That's
I have
okay.
every intent of reading it. My husband has read it.
Oh, good.
And he loved it.
Good.
So it was like True Riches.
Yes.
So I'm going to read that one. It's on my list. But the only book, I read a lot for work. So I think that's why personal reading, I struggle with it.
I get it.
But the book I read every day is my Bible. So I did finish my Bible like cover to cover. Like I literally started in Old Testament, like Genesis to Revelations. And I finished that last year. So that was a big accomplishment because that's like the longest book I've read in a very long time.
Yeah,
So.
I bet. So are you going back and like reading different chapters now?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm reading Acts right now. So I'm
Oh,
kind of
okay.
redoing the New Testament because, Old Testament, it was tough to get through that one.
I'm going through the Old Testament
It's
now.
hard.
Yes, I'm doing
It's
that now.
hard.
And then we are both faith-based firms,
Yes.
which is awesome. Love that about you. And so I'm sure stewardship is huge in your life. And I was actually looking at your website before we were chatting, and I noticed a giving section on your website. So tell us about what do you do to give back?
Yeah, so first and foremost, financially, we give back typically to like faith-based organizations that we feel are doing like the work of the hands and feet of Christ. So those type of organizations we really try to partner with on a financial basis. And then personally, I give a lot of time to organizations that I believe in. So one of those is Lisa V's Carolinas, which they serve children affected by foster and kinship care.
I know them.
Yes. So they're in Gastonia. They are absolutely wonderful. They have an event coming up in March. If you want to attend Vision Night, that's like their big event of the year. But yeah, I'm on the board for them. I have been for almost 2 years. So I spend a lot of time helping out that organization. And then I'm also on the advisory board for the Christian Business Chamber. So we do coffees. We try to network with, faith-minded individuals. So I try to help that organization out more strategically. So yeah, time and money, I guess, is the way we give back.
I love that. All right, now it's another fun segment that we do.
Ooh.
It's called our 5-minute fast fire.
All right.
So I'm going to ask you 5 questions, fun questions, no pressure whatsoever, and then we're just going to get through them all in 5 minutes.
All right.
I think you'll
The
do fine.
efficiency.
Very efficient. That's what we do here. So let me get this going. All right, I'm going to start the timer and ask you your first question. So, what's your favorite book of all time?
Oof. Oh, okay. My favorite book of all time is definitely the Bible. My favorite book in the Bible is probably Ecclesiastes or Proverbs. And my favorite other book, I don't like fiction. Like if I'm going to read something, I'm like, I want to learn something. So there's a Brene Brown book called Braving the Wilderness.
Okay.
Love that book.
Okay.
Great
Check
book.
that one out.
Mm-hmm.
If you weren't an attorney, what would you be?
I would be probably a boutique owner. I absolutely love clothes. I really do. I love clothes. I love fashion. I love like helping people style themselves. Like I just get a lot of joy from like putting things together. Just having like cute little knickknacks. So that would probably be me.
All
Maybe
right.
it will be me in this life, but.
Well, then bonus question to that question. What's your favorite place to shop?
Ooh, lately I've been really liking Altered States.
Okay.
I like them a lot. Where else? I do a lot of online shopping.
Same.
Tucker Nut, I like. Honestly, anywhere. Like anywhere, I like to shop.
I get that. I'm a Bloomingdale's girl myself.
Oh,
Just
yes.
being from New York, that's my spot.
Yes.
All right, what is your biggest pet peeve in contracts that you see?
Probably when people just don't sign it. It's like you spend all this time, like sign the contract, or just typos. It's probably just the attorney in me. Like I'm like, what happened? Like let's fix this. So, yeah, I guess that.
What's one legal term or concept that investors out there should know?
I would say like any like tax deferral program is huge. So like any type of like agritourism, I would really like look into that if you're in North Carolina and you're looking to invest in rural areas like North Carolina agritourism. 1031 exchanges. Absolutely make sure that if you are investing, you're not using it for personal use. A 1031 exchange is something you should certainly be doing.
We've had Matt Limbo on here. You can go back to that podcast too.
Yes.
Listen to him.
And then what's another good one? 1031s. I don't know. Just try to defer your taxes if you can. Try to pay less taxes.
Operating agreement. Also.
Yes, have an operating agreement so you can get financing because your bank's not going to lend to you if you don't have that.
What's one of the most interesting clauses that you've ever seen in a contract or that you have put in a contract?
Yes, I have put one in a contract. I think this is so funny. It is a landlord. They own a art gallery, but neighboring to that is a brewery. And so they lease to the brewery, and my client, whose landlord, is like, I really want a provision in there where I can get free beer. I was like, well, let's put it in there. So like at the very end, it's like a free beer per day. I should have probably thought about adding a rollover provision. Like if he doesn't use his beer, he could get, 2 the next day, but that'll maybe be in an amended version of that provision. Yeah.
That's a good one. I like that a lot. I think I need to hire you as my attorney because that's fun.
Yes. You got to keep it fun.
Awesome. All right. Well, we did that with a minute and a half to spare. Very efficient.
All right.
As a good attorney is.
All right.
Well, Kayla, it has been awesome having you here. You have been a wealth of knowledge. I cannot believe we've been talking probably for over 45 minutes.
Oh my
gosh.
I
have a feeling. I have an internal clock.
Mm-hmm.
But you have given so much information to the listeners. I think that people are going to be calling you off the hook now. So thank you again for being here.
Of course.
And if you're listening and you are not sure about your properties and your entity structure, again, that is what we do at Branch Wealth Partners. We work with people like Kayla, like Sean Williams from last week's podcast, and we help you get to where you need to be. So you know where to find us, branchwealthpartners.com. You can schedule a call. My email address is on there. Reach out to me, and we will point you in the right direction. So thank you for being here. We will see you next time.